All right. So we are back today to talk about something that is a phrase that has kind of entered my hemisphere, my understanding, kind of more recently. And really, it has been in connection with the changing in the education standards. And maybe it's just because I'm working a lot more on understanding those education standards and those changes that I'm hearing the phrase work or working at the top of your credential. And I want to have a conversation with you, Kent. And I'm sure that, like, if I have understandings that I need clarified, then majority of our audience does too. And being in the education side of it, I know that you can help shed some light, but you're also just such a progressive thinker that it's nice to talk these things through with you, so that not only can I can have a clear understanding, but so that when other people are having conversation with their peers, they can speak intelligently to this and have some constructive dialogue around accountability, personally and professionally. So do you know, like, where the origins of this came from, or how you first became familiar with it? Or if not, just kind of like sharing with us your initial thoughts on this phrase.
Yeah. I don't know where I first heard it. I remember hearing it from Mark Larson, who's the director of athletic training services at Boston University.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if it was at a Katie conference or it was a time he was speaking at DAT weekend for us,
Sure.
but we were having a conversation about physician privileging and this idea and this almost obligation
Mm.
and professional responsibility to practice at the top of our license or practice at the top of our credential.
Uh-huh.
And when I first heard it, it resonated strongly with just the way I practice, the way I choose to educate others in the post-professional space. And I think that's where I've heard it most. And I think as the profession has continued to transition with elevating the educational standards and elevating practice,
Mm-hmm.
I think that elevating practice is really practicing at the top of your credential, wherever
Okay.
that is.
Sure.
So, so that's kind of the origins, and it's definitely been in the vernacular of many athletic training educators for 3 or 4 years now.
Okay.
We're starting to see with the implementation of the new standards that becoming widespread usage, and it's really a conversation piece that we're all having, which is part of the reason we're talking about it today.
Right, right. And so, one of the things that comes to mind when I hear this phrase is kind of like the joke that the doctor who graduates at the top of his class and at the bottom of his class is still a doctor. And, who do you want operating on you? And the same thing for a lawyer or whatever else it is. So all of us have the same credential. On paper, all of us are equal, if you will, from a credentialing or a licensure standpoint. So let's start with the why. Like, what is the why behind this push, or even just this general conversation around the relevance of working at the top of our credential?
Well, I think that the credential is the bare minimum, right? The credential is the
Mm.
entry point. We have
Oh,
to.
wow.
I don't know who has said this, but I've heard this several times, that the finish line is not passing the VOC exam. That's the starting line,
Oh,
right?
wow. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
going through school and going through your professional education is preparation, is like the training to
Yeah.
get ready to do the race. And
Totally.
passing the board of certification exam and becoming licensed, if that's what's in your state,
Uh-huh.
that's the starting line. You're
Yeah.
just getting started.
Right.
So I think the why with that for me really comes down to the patients we work with.
Yes.
One of the greatest things about athletic training is the rapport we're able to develop with the patients we work with. Those relationships And don't we want to provide the best care that we can,
Yeah.
that the law or our credential allows us to, or the physician we work with allows us to do,
Right.
so we can do a host of all sorts of things like increase efficiency, increase effectiveness. We it can be selfish too,
Hmm.
right? We can practice at the top of our credential for career advancement.
Yes.
if
Yeah.
if if I'm an employer and I'm looking for an athletic trainer who I want to hire,
Yes.
I want to hire someone who is doing more than the I want to make sure I phrase this correctly. I don't mean doing more in volume. I
Correct.
mean
Yeah.
who is engaging in higher quality care
Yes.
by practicing at or near the top of their credential.
Yeah, and that was kind of the thought that came to mind for me when I'm thinking about the why behind practicing the top of our credential is the selfish part of it, right? So my mind first of all directly goes to advocacy. Like
Mhm.
how much better you could demonstrate your capabilities for a salary raise. How much um more that you can put on, not more, how much better you can articulate your abilities or your skills in a resume, how you could get that professional advancement because you can show the professional development or the continued learning that you've engaged in that is towards the top of, and by the top I kind of think about it like you're kind of like stretching the limits, like
Mhm.
instead of so if we think of like the credential as like a sphere, like a ball, you could be right in the middle of it hanging out, like where perfectly fine. Like you've got plenty of space around you before you kind of start stretching the edges of it. And when we talk about the top, if you will, I'm kind of thinking like you're rubbing up against the top of the sphere where you're like trying to push your boundaries and trying to challenge yourself to do more, think more, be more in terms of a professional. um, and so yeah, I think the why for me is really related to that personal aspect of professional advancement, but then like the professional advancement of the profession too. Like if
Mhm.
all of us was at that boundary pushing edge, then we're going to be on the forefront of a lot of things, whether that's innovation or patient care or um, legislative activity or conversation with administrators, whatever it is, going into other settings, things like that. I think that yeah, that's when you were saying like the professional advancement, that's what really resonated with me on the why part um, of what it means to work at the top of your credential.
Yeah, I think that when you were talking about the sphere, I think that in athletic training, we work between, well, it's almost like a balloon
Yeah.
where our credential is kind of the core of who we are, the credential, the our ATC or our BOC credential
Yep.
is that centerpiece. And
Yes.
then the limits of that's where we really
They're
have to
so much
challenge ourselves.
larger,
It's yeah,
like
it is, because
yeah.
what can we do or what can't we do? And who
Hmm.
defines what we can't do?
Yeah.
Oftentimes we like to live in the comfort that state practice acts tell us what we can or can't do. Which sometimes they do,
Right.
sometimes they don't.
Right.
Sometimes it's more about the relationship with the physicians we have. Sometimes it's about the privileging we have from the physicians we work with and
Hmm.
what she's comfortable with us doing. Um, so I think that when we talk about practicing at the top of our credential or working at the top of our credential, it is a little scary because
Mm.
it's not well defined.
Hmm.
It's really not well defined because the uh, depending on the state practice act, there is language that tells us what we can and can't do, and other states pretty much allow us to do whatever we're privileged to do
Yeah.
from the physicians, and
Right.
that it's a scary place. It's like working close to the baseline of the credential is super comfortable
Yeah.
because we know it, right?
It's
We
what we were
know
taught. It's what we were told to do.
exactly.
It's what we've been given permission for.
Exactly. And yeah.
One of the thoughts that comes to mind as you're talking right now is something that we've spoken about previously, which is kind of this like strong versus weak side theory. So when you're talking, I'm thinking, well, strong side theory tells us that we're going to take the thing that we're already really good at and we're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. So whether that is rehab or evaluation or administrative skills, emergency management, primary care, whatever it is, we are going to take that is kind of like our specialty, and we're going to push it to see how far can we get with that. But I also wonder with the idea of weak side theory is maybe working at the top of our credential is as much about identifying the weaknesses that we have within our own practice, the areas that we have neglected since we've gotten credentialed, or that we just don't spend as much time doing in general, so we're not as proficient in those areas anymore, and kind of bringing that up to the skill set level that we have on those things that we are really comfortable with.
Yeah, right. Like I think that it is part of like, in order to practice at the top of our credential, we have to do the things we know we're supposed to do and do them well. Like
Mhm.
the based on our practice setting or based on where the patient panel we work with every day, of course, we may be stronger in some areas of clinical
Totally.
practice than others,
Yeah.
but there are, and I think this ties in directly with the elevation of the education standards. And I think that there's an emphasis on we need to do these things well, regardless of the patient panel we work with or regardless of the practice setting we work with. Things like evidence-based practice, patient-centered care, health and healthcare informatics, quality improvement and quality assurance. Those things, all of us have to do better at.
Mm.
And regardless of who we work with or the type of setting we work in. And if we're able to do those things well, it gives us space,
Mm.
right? It gives us space, it gives us confidence, it gives us permission,
Yeah.
or it gives other people the opportunity to give us permission
Mm-hmm.
to do what we can or want or feel like we should be doing to
Mm-hmm.
practice towards the top of our credential, because we're acting and behaving like our healthcare brothers and sisters.
Mm.
And there's some familiarity with that. So part of practicing at the top of our credential is ensuring that we are strengthening our weaknesses, but we're also strengthening, doing the invisible work
Mm.
that is not glamorous, and the work that we don't, that isn't the reason we got into athletic training. Many of us probably got into athletic training to work with patients, to build relationships, to be part of the team, whatever team that is, to engage in meaningful relationships, to help people going from when they get injured to when they return to play, seeing them from their best to their worst and back to their best.
Right.
That's meant probably the why for many of us.
Mm-hmm.
But we are also in the healthcare industry,
Right.
and policy development, documentation, quality improvement, quality assurance, integrating the best evidence with your clinical experiences and with the patient values, patient-centered care. All of those things are critically important,
Mm.
that allow us to be able to practice at the top of our license. So with the new educational standards, if we engage in quality improvement or quality assurance, or we engage in patient-centered care, or we engage in health and healthcare informatics, perhaps we find efficiencies in our practice, and we're not
Well,
spending a lot of our time doing things that are either ineffective or that take a lot of time for very little return.
and it's funny. So as you were talking about, and even after so when you were saying, how we strengthen our weaknesses, and I'm thinking to myself, well, how do we reconcile that? Like, how do we reconcile the two sides of it? Like knowing that we're going to have a strength. There are, based on our clinical practice, there are going to be areas that we excel at because the muscle memory, the things that we do every single day. And how do we reconcile that with this idea that we have to strengthen our weaknesses? And what I heard you just identify was like almost like core values. And I don't know if values is the right word for it, but there are core aspects of being a healthcare provider and working in a licensed and certified field that should permeate every single thing that you do. And those areas, the quality and improvement and assurance, the healthcare informatics, the documentation, the policy development, all of that is at play regardless of the setting, regardless of the patient population, and really regardless of whether you're doing ergonomics or I don't know, like regardless of what you're doing, those are like tenets, they're core tenets of how we deliver the care that we are, the services that we're delivering with our care.
Yeah, they are in fact the core competencies of healthcare, right? They are the core, regardless of your specialty or subspecialty or profession.
Right, that core
They have been
competency.
identified as the core competencies of what it means to be an effective healthcare provider. And I think you're exactly right when you were talking about regardless of what it is, because what does practicing at the top of your license mean?
Yes.
Because it's, I think oftentimes our default is to go to an intervention, right? Like
Mm.
dry needling or cupping or diagnostic ultrasound
Yes,
or
whatever the latest and greatest, especially technology is, that's what we perceive as top of our credential.
absolutely. And it, it certainly can be, but it
It's
doesn't have
one
to be.
version of it, maybe.
Right. Right. Practicing the top of your license is more than just interventions and more
Uh-huh.
than just treatments that are invasive or non-invasive or whatever we want to call them.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes we get ourselves stuck in this debate of, can you do this? Can you not do that? I'm not allowed to do invasive things. Who said you're not allowed to do invasive things? Right. And we get caught up and down and we get down this rabbit hole of, but what's happening is it's perpetuating our belief
Hmm.
that we should just stick to the core of what we do. And it's like, I wonder, I don't want to get too off topic, but I wonder if it's one of these like limiting beliefs or barriers that are kind of just ingrained in our professional socialization as athletic trainers, that we have to be conscious of what we can't do because we're not like a physical therapist, or we're not like a physician, or we're not like an EMT. We often describe ourselves by what we're not, as
Sure.
opposed to who we are.
Right.
And so, curious, could be completely off base,
Yeah.
but I think that we often get ourselves in this rabbit hole, but
Uh-huh.
unconsciously, is it a block that is protecting us from the true potential we have and the influence we can have in healthcare and the ownership and responsibility that we can take within our lives if we're able to work past this idea that practicing at the top of your license or practicing at the top of your credential is intervention based.
Mm.
It can be good old paper and pencil.
Well, and
Like,
so that's what I was just thinking, like when you had said previously that when we get uncomfortable, we go back to the core of our credential. The question that came to my mind was, what's the core of our credential? Like what we were taught in school? Like, I don't think that there necessarily are like cores there, but if we change our mind to think that the core competencies or the core of our healthcare delivery are the things that we've already stated, and that is what we continue to centralize ourselves back on, maybe there's a mindset shift there where when you start to get uncomfortable, you come back to, what are my documentation standards? What is my policy and procedure? Am I practicing quality assurance? Am I putting patient-centered care first?
Mhm.
And if you come back to that, I mean, that's best practices. That's,
Right. It's like I just finished reading Untamed by Glennon Doyle. It's like
yeah.
your touch tree. It's this point that you can come to if you feel like you're getting too lost.
Like going to
Or
base, like your
right,
stake, right?
exactly.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Exactly. It's coming back to the core of who you are as a professional. And I think oftentimes we try to use the practice analysis, but the thing with the practice analysis is it's based on, and that's how they make the BOC exam.
Mhm.
It's based on what practicing athletic trainers are doing now, or when they did the practice analysis,
Aha.
not based on what we could be doing.
Sure.
So because we have to remember that the Board of Certification exam is the starting line.
Yes.
Credentialing is the starting line. There are, just because it's on the BOC exam doesn't mean that's all we can do,
Right.
right? Or just because these are the domains of athletic training doesn't mean that that's always going to be the domains of athletic training.
That's like the springboard. That's where you
Right.
start at. And then everything beyond there is what you investigate and what you do under your physician, or that you get continued learning or professional development
Mm-hmm.
doing. All of that is kind of above and beyond that certification. The certification is just your ticket in the door, like you're saying, the
Right.
starting line.
Your ticket to be competent today.
Mm,
Not it's like your ticket to ride today. What tomorrow holds, it doesn't matter, because practice could have changed, and now you're behind. If you took the BOC exam in I took the BOC exam in 2009,
so did I.
in
Yeah.
in the last like not the current practice analysis. So the types of questions I had were different than the types of questions, and the the qualification to be an
Right.
athletic trainer was different than
Yeah.
it is today, than
Right.
the athletic
The
trainers who
same way
just
it was
recently
different
became
for us
certified.
as the people who did the apprenticeship route, the
Right,
internship route. Like it, and it should be, right? Like, but
exactly.
yeah. So how do we
Hmm.
accomplish this? What, I mean, now that we've kind of wrapped our heads around what this is and the why that's kind of driving the conversation behind it, how do we accomplish this? I think for me, like in my level of understanding, what I mentioned, like switching the thinking towards, those core tenets, those core competencies, is one way of doing it. What thoughts do you have on how you work at the top of your credential?
I mean, you nailed it on the head. I think first and foremost, it comes down to you
Yeah.
opening the possibility
Mm,
that I think you have to say there's a possibility. I'm not quite sure what this looks like, but there is a possibility for me to provide higher quality care. And it's not I can provide more care.
yeah.
I think in an attempt to practice at the top of our license, we've said we're going to see more patients. We're going to do a volume-based service
Yeah.
as opposed to a quality-based service.
Right.
And so if you say there's a possibility that the way that we've been doing this could be improved, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's step one. We were talking about this a little earlier, but I think seeking out mentors, seeking
Mm-hmm.
out progressive mentors who maybe they're in your state.
Mm-hmm.
Find the people who are at the leading edge of practice, whether that's across the country, or if you have more specific questions about, can I do this in Indiana, or can I do this in Georgia?
Mm-hmm.
Find those progressive mentors, because they may be already practicing at or near the top of their credential.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know, if you ask them, they can help you identify the barriers that they experience,
Yes.
whether
Yeah.
those would be mental blocks and shifts that we have to make,
Yep.
or administrative or privileging blocks, or policy blocks. What are the steps that they had to go through in order to do? That's a great way to learn.
Yeah.
And but it cannot just be any mentor. It just can't be someone that you're familiar with. You
Mm,
have to have a purpose in seeking out that person. I think that's number two. Number one, you have to change your mind. Number two, you have to seek out a progressive mentor who can help you move on that path. And I think maybe it's number three, or it's a foundation, is be committed to professional development, and with an understanding that professional development is not continuing education. To do
yes.
things for the sake of learning and for the sake of growing for you, not for the sake of making sure that you have your 50 CEUs by the
Again,
end of the 2 year
meeting
reporting period.
meeting bare minimums, meeting standards versus increasing competency, increasing delivery of care, figuring out how to be a genuinely better quality professional, which may or may not count towards the continuing education that you're required to get.
And you have to take the last piece to close the loop is you have to take action on it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have a mentor and if you made up your mind that there is a possibility, but you never take action, then you never provide yourself with the confidence that you never close that feedback loop to continue your mind thinking, wow, this could be a possibility and I can do it. And then if you do encounter a challenge, you don't have any experience to
Uh-huh.
tell or talk to a mentor about. You have to do it and fail,
Yes.
or at least face some pretty strong friction,
Yep.
and then find someone who's been there before and ask them how they overcame it.
Right.
Ask them for some advice. And they should not give you the answer, but they certainly can provide you with some tips that can help you move past that current block, whether that's an actual block or a mindset block.
That's what was coming to mind when you were talking was you have to get uncomfortable. And whether you need to get comfortable being uncomfortable, I mean, that's in an ideal state you are comfortable being uncomfortable, but even if you're not comfortable with it, period, you need to get uncomfortable. And whether that is seeking out those relationships, whether it's identifying weaknesses within yourself, whether it's taking on a new skill that intimidates you, or approaching conversations that you're unsure of how they're going to come out. I think all of that is part of strengthening the musculature that is required to gain confidence. And yes, we're going to fail. And yes, there are going to be situations where we don't like the outcome of it. It doesn't even have to be a failure. It's just, it creates friction inside of us, or we have a self-fulfilling prophecy of, see, I told you I wasn't going to get that raise, or I told you the physician wasn't going to let me add that to my standing orders with them. But going down that journey and building neural pathways that are of a like challenging state, if you will, like when you start to get to a place of constantly being uncomfortable in whatever it is, I think that we do build so much resilience mentally, and then we have the tenacity to take on larger and larger challenges. So it can start with self-advocacy. It can start with something that is just, a toe dip in the water of, I'm going to change my documentation practices, and I'm going to challenge myself for the next 2 weeks to increase my documentation by 25%. Like, that is a small, attainable, it's a SMART goal, right?
Right.
It's something that you can work towards. And then, you don't have to start by going and getting a dry needling certification. You don't have to start by going and taking on a huge conversation with your employer or with a legislator. It can be smaller actions, but the feeling of being uncomfortable is really important in a safe way, right? We don't want to be uncomfortable in delivering a new skill to a patient. We don't want to be
Right.
uncomfortable in an emergency situation that we obviously weren't prepared for. That's not the type of uncomfortable. It's more of in I don't want to say isolated, but in controlled situations, if we can try to stretch that level of comfort, I think that's like kind of a how in my brain.
And as you start, or as anyone starts to engage in this, the further along the path they get, we will all start to understand that there is no top.
Oh, yeah.
If you talk, if you, when you seek out a mentor who's someone who you respect, who you think is progressive and practicing at the top of their license, they'll say, I'm practicing athletic training. Right? They are practicing athletic training. It's the top of what you think the credential is right now.
Sure.
Right? And as we continue to move and make those small incremental changes, it's habit formation that should and hopefully lasts our entire career.
Yeah.
As an athlete, like, so we should be the best athletic trainer we can when we are getting ready to walk out the door for the last time. I think one of the, we often use, and my preceptors, I had fantastic preceptors, but when I was going through school, many of them would say, you're going to be the best right after you finish the BOC exam because you know all the newest information and you know so much more than me.
Interesting.
And while I don't know if that was, I don't believe that is true today.
Sure.
Because they may understand where we're, what athletic trainers are doing today the best. But is that part of our professional responsibility to continue to develop and move closer to the top of whatever our license looks like? And isn't that the real purpose of continuing education, right? Isn't that the real purpose of professional development?
Yeah.
It's not like, again, it's not to check a box. The purpose of professional development is, and the purpose of continuing education is not to check a box.
Yes.
The purpose is professional growth.
Yeah.
And we can't, oftentimes, I think, since we are so busy, many of us are busy as athletic trainers, we say, I just got to get this done. I just got to get this done. And we may learn some really interesting pearls of wisdom or nuggets, but then we never implement them.
Yes. Implementation and application of practice is, I think, in my own experience, one of the major missing pieces of continuing education.
Right.
Learning it is one thing, and applying it, to me, that is part of learning, is I have to apply in order to truly understand. But a lot of times when we sit in on conferences, yes, we're hearing it, we're maybe absorbing it, but like there's survey at the end where it says, how will your practice change or will your practice improve? I mean, in theory, but the application of that, where the rubber meets the road of me going and getting that, new evidence and applying it in my practice, there's a lot larger gap there than it is me going and sitting and listening to the information.
Right. Think about how we learned for everyone who went to the curriculum route, where you would go and have your didactic education, then you'd have clinical education, and you were mentored or supervised by a preceptor or a clinical instructor, whoever that was, and then you got feedback, and then you revised it. It's not like the first time you learned what a anterior drawer test was at the ankle is you had it. You were scared to death to do it. And then your professor said, put your hand here. Then you tried it and it didn't work. And then you had a patient say, I'm never going to let you take my ankles again. Like, all those things happen. But once again, I think this is a mindset shift. What if we never leave school? What if our mindset shift is we never leave school and we want to learn how to suture? So we go, we learn about it at a conference. It's a didactic and a skill practice at the convention. No one's going to have the confidence to go, oh, I got a laceration, I'm just going to suture something. Right? No one, not even physicians, no nurses, no athletic trainer.
That shouldn't be the expectation.
Right. That's not the expectation.
Yeah.
But the expectation is that you learn that, and then you go to your physician and say, I would like to implement this into my practice.
Yep.
What are ways that I can practice, you can supervise and provide feedback, And
Yes.
then we can come up with a list of simple lacerations that I feel comfortable and you feel comfortable with
Right.
me engaging in. And it's
Right.
not going to be like I went to an ATA, I went to this conference and I did this and now I'm going to do it. I mean, I don't think I'm not comfortable to do it in practice. I've learned it and I've
Yeah.
done it a couple, not on people, but I've done it on pigskin before. But
Right.
there's no way I would ever do that because I've never had the opportunity to deliberately practice with feedback.
Yes.
And I think so
Mm,
often we do, and I also think that there's a desire for that because
mm,
you see many athletic trainers go to weekend or week-long courses that are intensive hands-on and they get practice,
yeah.
but still a weekend or a week intensive practice usually isn't enough to
You
be.
have to keep going after
You
that.
have to
Yeah.
keep going with it,
That's the
right?
starting line. That's
Right.
the, when you go and you take the course on BFR, cupping,
Hmm.
any of these interventions or increased skill competencies, you're simply learning the foundational
Hmm.
concepts of it. And now you have to go and practice it on friends, on patients, whatever it is. You have to figure out what are the outcomes as a result of my intervention,
Hmm.
tweak those. I mean, that's what makes us unique practitioners, is that we have a different delivery. That's why for me, a modified Lockman's I have to do because my hands are so small. Well, Kent may not even know how to teach me how to do a modified Lockman's because he's never had to learn how to do that. And that is the value of different mentorship and preceptors and clinical instructors, is they've found ways that work for them and that might work for you, or you can take an adapted form of what they're doing. And that is the beauty of how we all are able to practice healthcare and deliver our services. And when you're writing as a resume, that's what differentiates you from the next person. Not that I do a modified Lockman's and that you don't. It's
Hmm.
more so that I've found ways to adapt what is considered, the streamlined way of doing something so that it works for me, so that my patient care
Hmm.
isn't hindered. If I was only taught one way how to do a Lockman's, I would have to not do a Lockman's as part of my knee evaluation because I physically can't, like my hands, depending on the size of the patient, but it would be a limitation for me. And kind of circling back to what you were saying in the beginning, like if we overcome these limiting beliefs and we're able to find different ways, if we go back to those core tenets of, patient-centered care, evidence-based practice, quality improvement, um, all the things that we've said already, then if that's the why, if that's kind of the core, then it's so much easier to come back to that and say, okay, how do I deliver in this way? How do I show up with this? It's less construed to say, well, how does building a policy and procedure manual have anything to do with my clinical evaluation of the cervical spine? They're exactly the same when you get back to the core tenets.
Absolutely. And it doesn't, I know we got down the rabbit hole of interventions because I think they're so easy to talk about.
It is,
But
yeah.
as you mentioned, documentation practices, you have to, if you're going to change them, you have to hold yourself accountable or have an accountability partner to hold you accountable and
Right,
engage in the things that healthcare engages in.
right.
Document review. And the first mindset block is HIPAA. I
Yeah,
can't share because of HIPAA, or they play for a different team. You can de-identify
yes.
your records and you can have an audit of,
Yep,
or you can work with the team physician and you can have her do a document review.
yep,
She has privilege to see those documents.
yes,
And
yes.
so you can ask her to engage in a document review with
Yep.
you and identify areas for improvement. So there, if your initial, if anyone watches this or listens to this and says, I want to engage in this, and they start to move down that path and they have resistance, don't stop at the resistance.
Mm,
Take a step back, feel the resistance, and say, where is this coming from? And
yeah,
approach it from a different angle.
love that. Do it despite the fear.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I mean, this has helped me really think through a lot more clearly. And, I'll check the box that I think that my patient outcomes will improve after this. Because it just is so much easier. First of all, it's not just a phrase, it's not just kind of this catch term that we're saying flippantly, or that is like the lingo that everyone's kind of throwing around. It actually has roots around it now. And so it's not just the why and the what, but we actually, dove into some of the how too. And so, I mean, I feel a lot more well versed in how this could apply to me and my everyday practice. And I think that if I was to engage in this conversation with somebody else, even if they were in a completely different setting, especially if they were in a completely different setting, that I at least have like the principal understanding of what this means for us as athletic trainers and how we can apply it professionally, kind of as a whole.
Yeah, I've loved to get to learn from you this session. There, I think that the hashtag is elevate AT
Mm,
or elevate. I
mhm,
think the work is practicing at the top of your credential. And I
mm.
think the why, what, and how is the nitty gritty of how we make the hashtag a reality.
Yeah.
Like that, like we've got to do exactly what you're talking about here, and sticking with the why, what, and how of what it means to practice at the top of our credential, because that's the only way to elevate the entire profession
Yeah.
is through a critical mass of athletic trainers
The
choosing.
individual actions of every
Yes,
single person. Yep.
right. And it's
Yeah.
not and any individual. If enough individuals choose to act, the entire profession will rise.
Rising tide raises all boats. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, actually, that one's not relevant anymore,
Well, no,
right?
each individual molecule has to
There we
rise,
go.
right? Like each
There
bucket
we go. Yeah.
has to rise. But we
Yeah.
all have to make that individual choice that's related back to our why, because
Yes.
your why may be different than my why, may
It
be
will
different
be.
than any other athletic trainers out there's why.
Right. And that's why it was important for me to kind of like put a how behind this, because it is going to be different for everybody. And I think that the more that we dig into the nitty gritty, like the hashtag is a gross overgeneralization, and it has to be because you're trying to shrink it down to a single word. But if we're not having these conversations and we're not critically thinking through, what does that mean? How do I do that? Why is it important? What's the relevance to this? Then you can throw the hashtag around all you want. Fast forward 5 years and we're still in the same position.
Right. Couldn't
All
agree more.
right, another one in.
That's right. Excellent conversation today, Alicia.
Yeah.
It was good.